And there's also kind of ways you market these things as well. So, calling it a healthcare subscription rather than a health insurance policy kind of changes the way people think about it. And I'm like, oh, okay, if it's like a subscription and you can bundle it in with your Spotify package or something like that, that's a different way of approaching insurance, and it kind of makes younger people think about it differently.
You're listening to Rethinking Insurance, a podcast series from WTW where we discuss the issues facing P&C, life, and composite insurers around the globe, as well as exploring the latest tools, techniques, and innovations that will help you rethink insurance.
Hello and welcome to Rethinking Insurance. I'm your host, Sina Team, and today I'm delighted to be joined by my guests Jess Plewes and James Haybyrne. Thank you for joining me, Jess.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, James. Thank you.
Hey, Sina. Thanks for having us.
Jess and James are directors in our insurance consulting and technology practice in London, and you guys have a particular focus on health insurance. So you both worked at Bupa prior to joining WTW. Jess, you were a senior growth or the senior growth lead at Bupa Australia, and also worked quite a lot with health insurers as a consultant. James, you were the head of pricing transformation at Bupa UK. So we'll be talking about health insurance more generally today and what's changed and what health insurers can do to react or even lead the pack. In particular, since COVID, we've seen quite a lot of activity in the space, whether that's around affordability, plan design, cost trends or cost shifting, digitization, AI. But before we get into that, I've got this habit of finding out a little bit more about our guests before diving into the topic. So if you've listened to this podcast before, you know that I start by looking at Google results when searching for your names. So there is a James Haybyrne, who is the CEO of Strategic Thinking Group, and he wrote a book on how to run a business. The book's called Dream, Think, Become. So James, are you living a double life?
Yeah, I've always wondered this. I've spotted him myself before. He's seems to be based in Hong Kong, so I've always wanted to reach out to him and see where his name came from and how we know each other. But different James, unfortunately. But yeah, I need to reach out to him at some point.
And Jess, when searching for your name online, a lot of WTW results come up, but there's also a German Jessica Plewes who runs a karate school in Germany. And also Jessica Plewes, who's a university professor for anatomy. So are these the sort of results you wish one would find?
Yeah, I mean, the karate one's quite interesting. Why not?
Cool, second career choice. But I guess before we move on to karate, let's discuss health insurance, right? So I said in the beginning, providing consulting and technology solutions to health insurers is actually quite an exciting area for us. James, what would you say are the most significant global trends in health insurance for 2025?
Probably one of the key ones is around kind of general medical inflation rates and the long-term affordability of healthcare. And so we see, inflation's always a hot topic in insurance, but I think you see in medical inflation, it tends to have quite high rates relative to general kind of inflation. And so you always see that healthcare costs are rising more than standard other costs. And so as we go over time, it's essentially becoming more and more unaffordable. And there's a few different drivers of that. So there's always the costs of things like new drugs and medicines that are coming out that kind of drive the increase of the average costs of treatments. But it's really interesting since COVID. I think we've also seen quite a shift in behavior for how people are actually claiming, what they're claiming for and how they're using their policies. And I think since COVID, people have felt that they're going to make more use of their health policies. And so they're going out there and we're seeing kind of more claims than we've seen before. And that's driven not just therefore a cost increase in inflation, but also a kind of frequency change in inflation. And it's quite common across the world as we look at it. And so if those trends kind of continue and you see health going up, it creates big long-term problems for the industry. And so I think that's one of the big key trends that we're seeing.
Jess, anything to add to that?
Yeah. So, I guess like on the back of that, and given what James was just saying, I think what we have seen insurers like reacting to this. We do know that medical costs are going up. So it's been a real shift and a real kind of focus. And especially since COVID, where people are being more engaged in the health, where insurers are kind of looking to kind of change away from being like a health insurer to like a healthcare partner. They're really focusing more around like not being reactive, not being known to be like just to pay claims, but actually thinking more about proactive healthcare models. Because as James said, it's not sustainable. The way we're going at the moment, it's not sustainable. Aging population, incidence of chronic disease are going up. So like, I think insurers are really like shifting the focus and really thinking about preventative initiatives. And in this, like, really kind of focusing on like, how can they lower their costs? Well, one thing in particular they can do is try and improve the health outcomes and like by improving the underlying health of the individuals. So yeah, we've seen a real focus on this kind of proactive health. And I think that what has been quite interesting in this and what's made the health space even more exciting is it's kind of changed the dynamics of the industry in terms of like the competitive landscape. Because yes, they're known as like health insurers, but how can they get into this preventative space? Like we've been seeing a lot more like, some more strategic partnerships to try and like expand their ecosystem, I guess, and create this kind of like health ecosystem. And we're seeing, other players enter the market in terms of like looking to particularly focus on certain areas of their health value chain.
That's useful background. And you already touched on sort of the innovation that's happening in the health insurance product space. What do you think are the biggest changes generally you're seeing, and what impact have they made on insurers, Jess?
Yeah, I think, as I was saying, like preventative is key. So I think like everyone's buzzwords, but definitely the wellness programs. Like I think people are really kind of getting into those kind of really focusing on wellness and we've seen the vitality model that and it's kind of like all about like how can we stay well. And I think that insurers are really leveraging those kind of well-being propositions to keep people well, improve outcomes, but also kind of engagement. Like there's been a focus since COVID, people are naturally a bit more engaged. So it's kind of how can we gamify this and how can we kind of try and keep people engaged to kind of improve their health. And that's kind of on the spectrum of proactive care. But then I think in terms of the products and the innovation, I think they're really leveraging like data and analytics to be a bit more focused in terms of like chronic disease programs. How can we kind of leverage those to support customers, or like mental health packages? Like how can we focus on some more specific products around that? There's quite a lot being done at the moment. We see around like trying to connect care a bit more. So in terms of when I said about the ecosystems, like how can customers kind of connect the care from that first initial like GP visit all the way through to like potentially a hospital stay. So some key product changes.
So yeah, I'd probably say there's a couple of other extra areas as well that I'd call out. So one is probably around digital health. So I think in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of new kind of virtual products coming out. So one of the most standard ones is things like virtual GP. So now you can contact your GP via an app on the phone. And so when people might struggle to get to GPs via the traditional methods, you can use this instead, and you can easily get to them on your phone. So I think that's a really interesting development. And there's loads of new digital versions coming out that can support health insurers with their products. So I saw one recently where you sent a photo of a mole off onto an app, and then it would kind of use AI to scan it and have a look and see if they thought it was likely to be cancerous or not, and would kind of flag up a risk and refer you to a doctor if they thought that it looked like it was going to have a problem. And obviously there's loads of information as well around kind of like your heart rate and things like this. And we're starting to see some people trying to track all of your like Apple Health data and try and see when your heart starts acting unusual, they might flag up a notification to you and say, hey, there's something funny going on. You might want to go see a doctor right now. So I'm loving all of these changes that they're making to these products and making it really exciting and having lots of new innovations. I think one of the bigger problems I've got with it is just figuring out which of these is actually helpful for customers, which ones add value to you as a business, and which are actually just creating more claims that don't actually help the customer in the long run is something that I think insurers have to figure out. And I think another area is probably around how people are changing the product to attract younger customers. So I think the traditional method of insurance was you buy a policy, you pay a couple of £1,000 maybe a year, and you hope never to use it because you don't want to You don't want to get ill, really. So if you don't have to use a policy, that's great. But I think what we're seeing from younger people is they want to get more value out of their policy. So it's not that good for younger people just having a policy that they never really get any value of. So they want to kind of see some benefit to themselves. And so insurers are having to think a little bit differently about how you structure your product. How can I kind of show the value of it right now, rather than waiting to someone to make a claim until they see any value? And there's also kind of ways you market these things as well. So, calling it a healthcare subscription rather than a health insurance policy kind of changes the way people think about it. And I'm like, oh, okay, if it's like a subscription and you can bundle it in with your Spotify package or something like that, that's a different way of approaching insurance, and it kind of makes younger people think about it differently. So, yeah, I think the products part's really exciting. Lots of changes going on, and I'm excited to see how the products continue to develop going forward.
Yeah, I think digital healthcare is definitely an interesting topic. I think also just to kind of touch on that, I think that, given the rising costs, we're actually seeing insurers as well looking at alternative care offerings. For example, like cancer in the home settings, or, how can we get people out of hospital either earlier and transition to the home to kind of look to lower those costs. And, we are seeing that, patients do like being at home to receive treatment. And also, I guess it's value for the customer and also value for the insurer in terms of like it's a lower cost setting. And I think what's important for the insurers is to think about like how can they shift some of those costs out of the hospital setting, but then also how can they adjust their experience and think about it when they're projecting out and how their members' behaviors are changing.
And so it becomes pretty obvious that there's just a wealth of data that health insurers are sitting on, right? Or can be sitting on. So how should insurers use AI and advanced analytical capabilities to actually improve their offerings? James, if you want to go first.
Sure, yeah. So this is a really key area, as you say. Like, the more and more data you get, the more interesting insights that you can pull out of it. And so using advanced analytics to get those insights is increasingly important. And so we're seeing a lot of investment in this. So whether it's the technology that you use to kind of be able to pull this out, but then also how you use it and what you're kind of using your analytics to call out. So within health insurance, one of the big things is around claims. So when I'm selling a policy, I have no idea what the claims cost is going to be for somebody that I'm selling to. But with all the data that we've got now, you can start to use that analytics to say, okay, I can get a really good picture of what's the cancer risk for this individual, or what's the risk of them having some kind of musculoskeletal problem. And you can start to use analytics to get really granular in terms of understanding the claims risk that a customer presents to you. And there's lots of new techniques that can extract more and more value out from that. So we kind of see traditional statistical techniques being supplemented now with like machine learning and additional AI techniques to understand that customer better. Because if you understand the customer better, you can sell policies to the right risks, and you can kind of stay away from some of the bad risks that seem to like they're underpriced. And we're seeing that as well in terms of customer behavior as well. So I can understand whether a customer is going to lapse, or whether they're going to buy my policy or not, or whether this claim is going to turn bad and it's like a claim for that I therefore need to track more closely. So we're seeing some really interesting use cases for analytics. And it's also quite useful because when you understand the customers as well as kind of getting a really more accurate price that you can use for them, for instance, we're also seeing people then use that information to target new products. So if I know that a certain customer has a much higher cancer risk, or they have a much higher risk of getting back problems, I might have a product that kind of deals with that feature that they're likely to come up against, and you can kind of market and tailor your products towards different individuals. And so, yeah, with all this data, there's so much insights you can pull out and kind of tailor your proposition and your pricing much more closely to individuals.
Great. And I think that I wanted to touch on AI a little bit, but just something to add in terms of the data, I think, and I spoke to about like the wellness programs and all these programs around chronic disease management and mental health. I think one of the key things, and this is where I do think that insurers are looking to do, is like, how can we actually build up the business case in terms of like these initiatives? Because as you can imagine, sometimes it's like more of that upfront cost initially, and you won't actually see the benefit of these programs and these changes until that later stage. So I think that they're like, how can we leverage data, and like James said, in some of these advanced analytic techniques to actually help support the business case around some of these initiatives that are being introduced into the market. Then going on to that, I just wanted to kind of touch on AI and some of that is like, we have seen in the market there has been some nervousness around this, and it's potentially been mainly used more on the admin side. But as James said, in terms of like certain creating products that quite focus on the youth or certain chronic conditions, for example, we are seeing that like AI is potentially being used to help support insurers in terms of like the communication to customers. I think health is complex. There's a lot of complexity about where I go, where I get started. You go onto the insurer's website. It's like, okay, how can you help me? How can you help coordinate me? How can you tell me which is the best provider for me, and where do I start? Where do I go? So I think that we are seeing them leverage AI in that kind of communication space and that education. And in particular, in the youth market and the way that things have been progressed in this space, I think that they're really leveraging that for everything they do now. So I think it's like, how can insurers leverage that capability to improve that communication to customers?
And so, Jess, what sort of disruptions are you seeing on the horizon?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I think everything that James and I have spoken today around, and in terms of like thinking about these global trends, and not just insurer global trends in terms of like rising medical costs, aging population and higher incidence of chronic disease. It's like it's a health system issue. So I think that at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing that will be interesting to see going forward is the public-private play. It's an issue for both public and private. And look, at the moment that we're sat in the UK, and if we think about everything that's happening with the NHS, like in some ways the insurers are kind of riding the high on that a little bit, in terms of that we're actually seeing more and more people take out health insurance due to the long waiting list in the public space. And I think that, at the moment, insurers are kind of getting more people on, but like, are they coming and joining and leaving, or are you going to be able to create that value, like James said, and be able to kind of keep them long term? So, and what happens if the public system, if things do improve in the public system, what does that mean for the private health insurers in terms of like their proposition? Is their proposition still valuable enough for someone to put in money, given the cost of living pressures? So I think that some of the disruption that I see is like the interplay between public and private. And I think this going one step further from the UK, that there are different ways in terms of like the structures of the public and private system. Like it's very different over in Australia, for example, where 50% actually have private health insurance, and the public-private is definitely more of a hybrid. So yeah, I do see that. And whether, the big thing I just wanted to kind of add on the public-private split, and like it is a healthcare system issue, some of these trends, is that what might happen in terms of like reforms. I think that's something for insurers to think about in terms of like what changes might come out in the future. Okay, I think the other thing in terms of like what we're seeing is disruption, what could it be interesting in the future, is how we change our funding model. So at the moment, we're looking at like a fee for service, and we do know that there potentially has been some incidents of like over servicing, and there's potential talk around like, can we move to an alternative funding model in terms of like outcome-based funding, which I think is a really interesting topic. And how do we move to maybe more of a hybrid setting in terms of like certain procedures might be more of a fee for service, but then there might be some outcome-based funding for certain conditions. I think the one to think about there is like, how does it impact the patient, but also the provider? And, does that impact the way in which specialists think about which cases they take on, if they think about their funding being delivered based on the outcomes? And will they be less likely to take on those riskier cases?
A couple of extra things I would add as well. So one disruptions is always around things like new drugs that come out and the impact that they might have on society and treatments. So one of the new ones that's quite interesting is the impact of some of the new weight loss drugs like Ozempic. We've seen that kind of healthcare costs in Western societies have been paying out a lot more for things like diabetes, as kind of with our weights on average have gone up as societies. And so when you've got these new quite expensive drugs coming out, there's like big questions around, okay, what impact is that going to have on my claims that I've seen in the past? Is that going to reduce a lot of these chronic diabetes claims that I see? And is it therefore worth funding it and offsetting against the high costs? Or is it not going to have very much at all? And I might end up just kind of funding a new drug which actually doesn't have too much impact in the long run. And there's always new drugs and things like this coming out. So like lots of always disruptions from there and how that's going to impact us in the long run. And I also see kind of interesting in terms of like personalization of insurance and also medicine. And so we've seen some insurers, for instance, have started doing things like genome sequencing, where they will sequence the genome, kind of see if you're at risk of certain conditions, and then offer you like a tailored preventative plan to kind of stop you from, to try and help you from developing certain conditions that your genome would suggest you're more at risk of. And there's a question around how customers perceive something like that. So I mean, that sounds really great. Like you're going to give me something that's going to go, but you're using very personal data there. Where is that data going? How is it being used? And at the moment, they're offering to tailor you a preventative plan. But at what point do insurers start pushing more and more for saying, well, if I've got all this kind of really personalized information about yourself, can I use that to set you a more personal price? Because I understand your risk a lot better. And at the moment, ethically, that's not okay. There's restrictions on that. But I wonder, as we get kind of more techniques that are able to get more and more value out of your own personal genetic and biological data, will there be a push to use that in the insurance space a lot more freely? And should we, what's the ethical consequences of that? What do we think about all of that, and how will societies react? So I think that's a good long-term issue on the horizon to think about.
Yeah, it sounds like there's actually a lot going on here. So based on your prior roles in the industry, based on the projects you're working on with health insurers, and I guess the sort of perspectives you've given in the last 20 minutes, what are the key takeaways for you from this session?
I mean, I guess I think my three key things that I would say is one, all of this stuff always comes down to data. So like to understand the impact of new product features, or to do my better analytics, I always need data that's capturing all of this information, and it needs to be good quality data. So I would always say to insurers, be thinking about your data all the time. How is your data requirements going to change in the future? What data should you be collecting to enable you to stay on top with all of these developments? And how are you structuring that and making that accessible to your business? My second would be around then the analytics you do on top of that data. So what technology you're using to be able to pull out the key insights from your data, and then how are you thinking about what analytics to carry out? What should you be looking at? What are the things that are going to add value to you as a business that's going to make you stand out from other insurers? How are you going to understand customers better and get a better grip? And that's the whole point of using analytics, is to enable you to get a much better grip of what's going on and understanding what's happening. And then the third one is probably around, with all the new product developments going on, how do you assess the effectiveness and value for money that these are adding, and customer behavior that's going to have? How are you assessing all of that? And I would be thinking about having a framework that enables you to assess different options as they become available, so that you can make the decisions to partner with the right people in order to make your product stand out whilst also adding value for money.
Great. Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, I totally agree with all of those points. I think the final thing to raise, I think, will be the point around building those business cases for those initiatives. And to James's point is how we can leverage data and analytics to do that, because I think that's going to be key, because I think we can think about the long-term value rather than strategically thinking more short-term with all of this prevention and earlier intervention.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Jess, thank you for joining me. That was very insightful. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for joining this episode. If you found this interesting, then please join us on other episodes of Rethinking Insurance.
Thank you for joining us for this WTW podcast featuring the latest perspectives on the intersection of people, capital, and risk. For more information, visit the Insights section of WTWCO.com. This podcast is for general discussion and/or information only, is not intended to be relied upon, and action based on or in connection with anything contained herein should not be taken without first obtaining specific advice from a suitably qualified professional.